This is Sirens, a new series brought to you by the ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, and maybe lure some men to their deaths. You should definitely check out our recent mini episode if you haven't already with the glorious Valerie Insina, who is a breaking defense reporter and longtime friend of the pod, no matter what the pod is, on our discussion on Pentagon press corps history, what makes it special, what the day in the life is like, what it's like to go get Popeyes for lunch in the Pentagon, things like that. I'm Lauren DeYoung-Schulman.
I'm Erin Simpson.
And I'm Rada Iyengar-Plum.
All right, I have finished watching this season's Bake Off, so I'm
okay, but
so
I haven't.
excited.
No spoilers. No spoilers.
I'm not. No. Don't worry. I mean, come on. Like, who? It's pretty obvious.
I know. Yeah, whatever.
Right, but
no spoilers.
You're happy.
All right.
They eat baked
Anyway, Bake Off. Bake Off. Your favorite Bake Off challenge?
So I just watched the episode on desserts, and I think it's my favorite Bake Off challenge because you're like, wait, aren't the rest of them also desserts? Right? It's a very good insight into the British meaning of dessert as opposed to, biscuit day. I'm like, well, isn't a cookie a dessert? No. And all the other sort of things. So I like the and then they're also kind of over the top and require a lot of baking technique, like a bain-marie and all of these things. So dessert week is a very good Bake Off challenge.
Yeah, I'm really torn. I really love anything that involves exciting adventures in fondant because I did not know that was a thing prior to the show's existence. I mean, I understood the concept of it there, but I did not appreciate it.
With fondant, as I discovered when we did this with my nieces one time. They're like, "This is gross." I'm like, "It's only here for decorative purposes."
Yes, only here for this.
Do your children not watch? Is it Cake?
They do, but but Great British Bake Off predates my coming to the Great British Bake Offs predates kids really, but predates them. But let's not do that there. But I do love the holiday specials, and in particular, I love the random weird holiday treat thing they get, the challenge they give, where there's here are all the ingredients and an oven temperature. Bake this thing you've never heard of. That's a weird British treat. Go. And then they create all sorts of weird concoctions. And I'm like, that's great. And that's anyway kind of how I bake to start with.
One of the holiday specials had two of the actresses from Dairy Girls, and it's just incredible chaos. It's really good.
That's amazing. I think so. In terms of actual practical, the thing I enjoy eating the episode is my favorite is Biscuit Week. Mm-hmm. However, I always love, I think they call it patisserie week, the week that they have to fold dough over butter over and over again, because it is inevitably, and they must do this on purpose, it's inevitably the week where it's a jillion degrees outside, and there's no way in hell that it's going to work. It's all going to fall apart. Everything's going to melt all over the floor. Paul is going to say oh, you don't have enough of a whatever the shiny thing on croissants is, and Prue's going to look very miserable. Lamination. Yes, thank you, lamination. I also when I watch, one of my favorite things is over the years we've now acquired the here's what Prue likes, booze. Here's what Paul likes, strange pina colada flavor. What Paul doesn't like, matcha.
Right.
Or curry in places where he's not expecting curry. Love that. I just love this this gentle sensation of feeling as though I don't really care what happens.
I love how much Prue loves booze and a baked good. I mean, it is.
But also fantastic. She's not wrong. I will tell you that is the secret to my whipped cream recipe. That everyone's this is the best whipped cream I've ever had. I was it just has alcohol in it. That's why you like it.
I will not spoil it, Erin, but in it's either the last episode or the second to last episode, Prue says out loud, "It's a little too boozy for me." No. And I just thought is she dying? What's going on?
Okay. I'll text you when I get to it. All right. Unfortunately, we have to shift gears.
We do. Okay, well, this could be a reading show. This could be a bake-off show. But instead, we're going to start with It's a Drill, where we go through various things that people are obviously, because we're big nerds, talking about at cocktail parties in DC or whatever is substitute for cocktail parties. So first, we're going to start with, I believe this is Rada's topic on tariffs, which are trade taxes. And Rada, I got to tell you, Neil Katyal made me so happy in the Supreme Court argument this week.
Actual jig. I mean, I was I have been saying this, and here we all are. Now, and not just them, but the actual Supreme Court justices. Okay, so for folks who, I don't know, don't follow the news and or tariffs and or taxes, the Supreme Court heard arguments on November 5th on whether Trump can unilaterally impose tariffs under my most favorite law abbreviation, which is IEEPA, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. I really feel like it's the onomatopoeia of laws. Anyway, so the Trump administration argued basically that there are two emergencies: persistent trade imbalances and fentanyl flooding. Now, I just would like to note for the readers / listeners that none of the taxes / tariffs necessarily deal with those, and you couldn't draw a straight line to them. But leaving that connection aside, the justices, both conservative and liberal, like if there's one thing that can unify America, it's that tariffs are indeed taxes. And they felt like...
And therefore belong to the legislative branch?
That's right. They belong to the legislative branch. So, I think there's definitely an uphill road for the Trump administration, but just intersect that with not just a few days before, there was a deal kind of, again, caveats, asterisks, but it's a drill, so we won't go too far into it, with Xi on what to do with China, with some key commitments included China halting fentanyl precursor flows, suspending rare earth export controls for at least a year, and ending retaliation against the U.S. semiconductor companies. There was also an agreement on purchasing 12 million metric tons of soybeans over the next several years. I think that amount each year, because we need to sell our soybeans somewhere. So
God, that's a lot of soybeans. I'm sure it's actually not, but it sounds like so many.
But bottom line, if the Supreme Court strikes down Trump's authority, then that tariff agreement reduction will be moot because he won't have those powers to do it, but also calls into question the entire trade ecosystem because, of course, all of the agreements have gone out the window with the imposition of these unilateral tariffs. So there is much mayhem and economic nerdery to follow.
I love the discussion about how they would possibly pay back the tariffs that have already gone into the Treasury. Like, whoa.
Amazing.
I'd like evidence that they've gone into the Treasury, but that's just me.
Same. One of the minor joys of this era that we're in right now is that in addition to following baseball games or whatever you would like on the blue skies or the Twitters, you can also follow court hearings on there in ways that are deeply fascinating. I just really enjoy it. Speaking of deeply fascinating things that I enjoy, Erin, what's going on with the elections?
So I should let the listeners know, we have a Google Doc and we both brainstorm topics and then fill them in. And right here it says election results !EMS. That's as far as we got, because as I was going to fill in election results and talk about how Abigail Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill, both national security women and Democrats won governor races in New York or New Jersey and Virginia, we then had a total spin-X over the weekend where I guess on the plus side, we are on a path to end the government shutdown by the Senate Dems totally capitulating. So not going to dive too deep into either of those, other than on the one hand, there was a fair amount of momentum and a pretty strong rebuke across different, we talked about the governor's races. There were some other off-year election sorts of things going on that were pretty strongly indicated that folks were frustrated with the Trump administration. And then over the weekend, 8 Senate Democrats decided, I guess, that maybe enough pain had been inflicted, that we weren't on a path to get proper extension of the ACA premium subsidies, that the air traffic situation was untenable, all of which is true, all of which was also true a week ago. And instead, either had Chuck Schumer's total blessing and machinations to make sure that only people who were not up for election in 2026 voted for this, or they totally subverted Chuck Schumer's leadership and defected, which I don't believe, and broke off and did this deal. So we're recording Tuesday evening. We expect a House vote tomorrow that will effectively end the government shutdown, at least for right now. It's a CR through January. One minor bright point that I think is worth highlighting is that it does fully fund the Department of Agriculture for the year, which means that SNAP benefits, which we talked about in our last episode, will not be held hostage in the same way again this cycle. But whew, a lot going on the domestic politics side.
This is definitely one of those, like, all right, I can kind of come up with a rationale for why you did this, but you talked about it, not you, Aaron, they talked about it so badly in public. Like, what's wrong with all of you? Do you actually listen to yourselves? Last, it's a drill. So, I guess it was the last episode. Yes, last episode, we talked about the abrupt resignation of the Southcom commander, and neglected to mention something that I think probably folks were paying a lot of attention to earlier on in this administration, but it became quieter. And that is the trend of general officer, flag officer firings that are going on in the Department of Defense. There's a great story in the New York Times by Greg Jaffe, Helene Cooper, and I cannot remember the third reporter's name, but it highlights this, that we went from really big, very public, very loud, I'm firing you for these reasons, you are too woke, you're too affiliated with the prior administration, and whatever it was, to much more quiet departures of the General Officer Corps over the last few months. And a lot of them moving from like they were fired to quietly resigning. And to me, this is interesting for a whole lot of reasons and like deserves a longer explanation that we'll probably do at a later story. But one is, it appears to me as though there's some kind of deal being brought here. Like they're asking people to leave, they're encouraging people to leave, and if they do so quietly, then they'll be allowed to resign and they'll be allowed to keep their retirement, or they'll not be knocked down to lower rank or whatever it is. I don't know that for certain, but that is what appears to be. That seems like a likelihood to me. The second is, to me, like, it's very atypical for this rate of general officer departure, and I think that for a career field, that it's not that it's steady necessarily per se, but it's fairly predictable. And like, these are the number of general officers that you need, and here's how they promoted, and here's things that you would presume that your prior ones would do before they became certain levels. Like, that's been knocked on its head, and you have, as a consequence, a lot of, I think, loss of leadership capacity that they were not expecting. So that people are being asked to play roles or fill roles that they were not anticipating, and there's going to be a gap at some point in time between kind of the 1-star, 2-star ranks, the 3-star, 4-stars, or like they'll have to promote people a lot faster. But the last thing I'll note is that it seems to me as though this is going to create, or is creating, a ton of institutional anxiety around what is actually driving all of these firings. Like, I'm sure there's a ton of scuttlebutt. I just gave you some of like what we hypothesize, but in an organization where it runs on gossip in a way that like we're doing in the show, I am positive that all kinds of rumors is floating around in terms of like why this is actually happening. How do you protect yourself? How do you keep your head below? Which is not necessarily the thing that we want our general officer corps to be doing. So anyway, I'm sure we'll come back to this, and I really appreciate the story that they highlighted, because it's definitely something that has flown below the radar for me, at least, but is worth us coming back to in a later episode.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a lot out there, and I've even heard from 1 and 2 stars who are sort of like, yeah, I know that I'm basically now career limited because I did too much X, Y, and Z advocacy, or I was involved in too much, support to diversity type groups, when I was younger in my career. And so I've been, they'll say, I've basically been told like, I will not be joining the next board. So that's not ideal, not ideal.
So, moving on, continuing on the topic of the Pentagon, into dumpster fires, things that are literally or figuratively on fire that have a larger impact on American institutions. First, want to talk about, and I am so delighted I have the two of you to talk to you about this, acquisition reform. The recent speech by Secretary Hegseth, in which he claimed that things were changing so much in the defense acquisition space, we won't even know what hit us. This is a really, really nerdy deep dive, but also it's like a gajillion dollars that is spent on a regular basis on your behalf of the American people. So I feel like it's worth paying attention to. So I don't even know how to say half these acronyms. POs?
PEOs.
PEOs. Okay. PEOs. Clearly, I've been out of the Pentagon too long. If PEOs, FAR clauses, and DITSA don't mean much to you, well, you're going to love this. You can skip ahead if you want, but you shouldn't. On the other hand, if you are related to Erin and has ever asked what she does at work, this is your time to listen. And Rada too, but both of you, Erin, I'm sure, is going to be delighted by this. So,
it's also why I usually change the topic. I just want my family to know this. It's because this is like really in the weeds, and I can't imagine they care.
we will, so everyone slow down to 1.0, maybe 7.75 in order to listen to this part. Secretary Hegseth, once again, gave this big public address. He did not, to my knowledge, call in every general officer and flag officer for this purpose, but this was instead at the National War College. And instead of the Red Wedding, he had a lot of defense industry executives and others to talk through. We are now focusing on speed to delivery is now our organizing principle, also war fighting and things like that. Creating a portfolio acquisition executives versus program executives offices, not officers. Commercial first and alternative proposal policies for non-FAR based contracting. We'll get into that, what that means in a minute.
Told you guys this was really exciting.
DTSA and DSEA, the Defense Technology Security Administration, and the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, not to be confused with DCSA,
totally
are
different.
moving to the Acquisition and Sustainment Office, which is still one and not two. Maybe someday they'll meet up again. All right, Aaron. Wasn't your office mentioned a little bit in the speech, and were you sort of like kind of vaguely proud while also being strangely disturbed? Tell me more about how did that feel, but also like what did he say and what should we learn from this?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely you guys are better at coming up with the relationship, metaphors.
Rom-com.
It's sort of like when your ex-boyfriend like marries someone who looks exactly like you, but like dumped you, and you're like, what was that about? I was not dumped. I want to be very clear. I left my own accord, of course. But so my old organization, the Joint Production Accelerator Cell, is now called the Wartime Production Unit. Asterisk, what war? Anyway, bygones, we'll move on. And they're also meant to have sort of a deal team within them that's supposed to get some better negotiations. There's like a Shea Assad flavor to that for real acquisition nerds in terms of like getting better, pricing and better negotiation terms. But I think as we'll sort of talk through the rest of this, it's really unclear to me how that like lines up against some of the other service prerogatives. There are a couple of things that I have talked about over the last few years and that I worked on a bit while I was in the Pentagon that made it into the guidance, primarily around scalable production strategies, including increased emphasis on licensed production so that like multiple companies could make like a component or multiple companies could make a certain kind of missile and then they just pay like a royalty to the originating designer. Also some updates to sort of how we do testing and qualification, which is often the barrier to bringing new suppliers into the supply chain. Those are like good ideas. We need to work through how to make that happen. But it's also, as we'll talk through a bit, the devil's in the details. Rada, what about you? What did you see in all of this?
Yeah, so maybe just taking a big step back. Defense acquisition is really slow, and we spend a lot of money. In part, government acquisition is governed by this set of pretty cumbersome set of rules called the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations. And the Department of Defense has a much more extensive set of rules under that called the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations, the DFARS. And that creates just like lots of rules and hoops to jump over. So the intuition here is twofold. One, to try to streamline how we do things. And that's really where the speed and the commercial first come through because you skip to new ways to get agreements. Actually, many of these are not contracts, they're agreements, which does have legal implications. But also it allows a different set of folks to be involved in both the way purchasing decisions are made and then overseen. So that's like bucket one. Bucket two is the department has long managed things in these groups called programs, which is on a specific thing you're buying. So if you're buying a specific kind of helicopter, that's a program. And a different kind of helicopter is a totally different program, even if they do roughly the same thing. Same with missiles, blah, blah, blah. So several years ago, I give you all this background to say, these are not bad ideas. These are good ideas. These are also extensions, really important extensions. And again, we should come back to that. Extensions aren't bad. These are not new crazy things. We had shifted to portfolio reviews when we were there or in early days of the Biden administration. For this reason, CAPE had switched to even doing program budget review in portfolios and capabilities rather than specific programs, because that's really how you understand what the department's doing. So like acronyms aside, I think the bottom line is this is really important set of extensions that are consistent, but there are different risks and trade-offs. I fully think they are worth taking, but shifting away from regulations and structures and rules and laws comes with trade-offs.
Just to build on that point, portfolios themselves were also like, they got rid of this later, but that whole concept was an extension of work that was done at the end of the Bush administration, which was an
Yes.
extension of work that was done. Can't remember what prior administration. So anyway, what is old is new again. And that's not, as you say, Rod, that's not necessarily bad. I think one of the downsides to it, in the way that people feel the need to put their stamp on it, is that you have to spend a lot of time on the stamp as opposed to just continuing and executing the work.
I was going to say, Rada was talking about these trade-offs, and one of the ones that the Secretary Hegseth really highlighted is that he supports increasing acquisition risk in order to decrease operational risk. That's in one of the documents that was flowed out, and that's really interesting, right? So, different people bear the burden of those different risks, right? Operational risk is felt by the operating forces. Acquisition risk, which unfortunately, or maybe appropriately, carries both civil and criminal penalties, is borne by the acquisition workforce. Much of which is civilian, some of which is uniform,
and the taxpayer.
And the taxpayer,
right? Like, just so we're really clear, acquisition risk is spending risk. I'm not saying we shouldn't take operational risk, but yes,
we'll get to that.
Speaking of stamps and speaking of Texas putting his stamp on this, is he actually, we talked about some of the barriers here, is he actually going to succeed? And what would that look like? What would success look like if he actually does?
So I think there's a couple ways to think about success, here. One is, will we get some, I don't know, new entrants, kind of these more innovative defense companies, non-traditional primes, getting large awards and then delivering on them. Both of those are important, right? Just giving contracts to companies is not sufficient. You actually need them to be able to deliver on the timelines and the capability level that they promise. That's a live running experiment. I think we will have, data on that within, 12 to 18 months. I think a second thing is really how the Congress responds to this, right? So it's one thing to do capability reviews. It's another thing to do capability-based budgeting and to say, I want Army missiles to have like one budget line, and I'm not interested in decomposing that between Patriots and Gimlers and a bunch of other things, right? The Senate Appropriations Committees do not tend to like that. In fact, they have mostly gone more and more specific over time. So the more cynical among us might say this could be an interesting way to break appropriator brain. And if that does happen, that would be a success for the department. Whether that's good for the taxpayer is a little bit different question, but it's definitely a department prerogative to do so. I honestly think that sort of Congress is the biggest obstacle to making this happen. Rada, what are your thoughts on likelihood of success or obstacles to quote unquote success?
I totally agree. The appropriator side is tough, though. Right now we're in a full capitulation mode, so maybe this is the time to change it. I mean, I generally feel like a big blocker here is color of money, which by that I mean, in the Department of Defense, in addition to acquisition, we have different types of money that can be spent on different things. So research and development versus production versus like maintenance and like these are all different pockets of money that Congress has historically, with a narrow set of exceptions, has bracketed. But to me, I feel like, look, I think the ideas are good. Actually, quite like this. I liked the Defense Acquisition Reform EO. Like, I am interested in who's writing these, and I would love to chat with them. Like, I think they're doing a lot, but there's a lot loaded onto very few words in this memo. Like, the memo's like 6 pages long. So, like, what's the implementation guidance? If you want to do commercial first, what does that look like? Do you now not need to comply with the FAR competition guidelines? If so, what things don't need to comply? What about
you don't even have to provide a compliant proposal, apparently, which is crazy town. Fun, but what is crazy town?
But does the department have the authority to like acquire things? You see, like there's just, and then there are deep FARs, which I'll just note are rules the department made itself above and beyond the FAR that apply to a whole bunch of things and often implement like rules and laws passed, for instance, through the National Defense Authorization Act. So how do we put those together? And then the last piece I'll just note is like who is going to do these things, because they were all fired. the federal workforce that buys things and writes the contracts, the new hires in all of the acquisition force, the fork in the road, and the various authorities that allow them, especially those who are hired in the under acquisition authorities, which are an accepted program, all of those folks were disproportionately treated in the first, I was going to say first half of this administration. I was like, first few months of this year, because we're at month 10. So I just say that to say, like, I'm not, I am philosophically aligned with many of the things here, but I care a lot more about doing acquisition reform than saying acquisition reform. And I am curious as to how we bridge that gap.
Yeah, in listening to both of you here, one of the things that occurs to me is that this gap between here's how we say you're supposed to do it versus all of the regs and rules that are supposed to come with just means lots of lawsuits, tons and tons and tons of lawsuits, because justifiably companies will have lots of space for challenge to say, like, well, which rules are we following here, which is a totally fair thing, but also be able to use that as space to say, like, well, I don't really know, like, which rules we're supposed to follow, so if they follow these rules and we follow this rules, like, how do we deal with this? But also, to Rada's point, we'd spent the last several years building up the acquisition workforce, not only in the Department of Defense, more broadly, using different kinds of authorities to bring in amazing talent and give them a lot of training on how to do stuff. So it takes people to be able to do this. There's a lot of detail in this. It is necessary for people to internalize, to think through, how do you implement this in a way that the department will follow these rules consistently? And it's not to say it's impossible for people to be able to generate all the paper that Rod is talking about, but it's not a small thing and going to take a bit of time to go from the high level speech to the implementation.
If there was anything that is a government capacity signal, it is acquisition, because you need the government to be a party in acquiring. So you need them to have the capacity to acquire.
And I was going to say, there's, one of the real core features of this is the shift to portfolio acquisition executives. But the people who are trained for that, right? The colonels, the 1-stars, right, who are kind of coming up in that, have all come up in, for the most part, FAR-based acquisitions. Maybe they've done other transactional authorities. Maybe they've done mid-tier acquisitions, right? These are, relatively new authorities in the last 7 or 8 years that actually have had real successes and, a few failures, but are quite flexible and provide a lot of the authority you need. But those are still program by program approaches. So the kind of training, the kind of plasticity of mind, the kind of risk trade-off that we're talking about is not resident in these individual officers, and, not the kinds of folks risk acceptance is not kind of folks you tend to, select for when you take your 2 and 3 stars into these program offices. So it'll be interesting, to say the least, referencing Lauren's previous segment on general officer firings and resignations, just how we get selected here.
Yeah, I'll give you guys a last question, and you with a short answer request, so we can move on to the next topic. And also, I feel like we could talk about this for a long time. We'll come back. But one of the things that's been fascinating to me in all the Biden administration lessons learned reports on, like, literally any topic you can imagine, is the number of time OTAs comes up over and over and over again. The political appointee class has gotten religion on OTAs, but to your point, both of you, the contracting officer corps has not. And it's not to say that they're against it per se. It's more that was not the religion they were brought up in. So we just have to move on from there. Okay, what should we look for next? So we talked about how hard it is to be able to do this implementation piece. Like, what's going to be some signals that you're watching for? Erin?
I would say 2. One is, many of these reforms and the things that I've talked about and the things that we were working on in JPAC are really around weapons and munitions, missiles and munitions. And so how do we extend this portfolio approach to much, platforms, right? Much larger pieces of equipment. So, are the Army procurement folks who do tanks and other, like, heavy vehicles, are they going to take a portfolio approach, right? Is the Air Force going to take a portfolio approach to fighter aircraft? Very interesting question. And I think one place you would look to see if that's happening is PB-27, is the president's budget when it comes out from DoD at some point next year, right? Does it take a portfolio approach, or are we still going program element by program element, through the budget? It's a tough, Kate may be doing some of those trade-offs, but they still submit a budget to the appropriators that looks like it has for quite a long time. So that's what I'll be watching.
So what I would say is like legislator response, because this is interesting until it is enforceable in law. And otherwise, to your point earlier, Lauren, it's a lot of lawsuits. So it's my understanding the NDAA is not through yet this year, for instance. And of course, there's another bite at that next year. So kind of open question on do you see movement in laws either in the budget on a long-term budget or in the NDAA that starts aligning Congress to this? Because I think that would be a signal that we really get some implementation.
So if you guys loved this discussion, you're going to love this next one even more. Erin,
oh my gosh.
over to you.
If there was anything that could warm my heart more than the combination of talking about trade taxes, acquisition, and then actual taxes, I don't know what it could be. So here we are talking about the end of direct file for taxes and why you should care. So let me start by saying that Lauren suggested this topic. And so I had the opportunity to like dive deep into it while I was preparing for this episode. And that started with like, what is direct file? And it turns out it was a free government run online service that let eligible taxpayers file simple federal tax tax returns. So you didn't need a private tax company. You didn't need to pay anything. And I think it's helpful to ground the initial topic. And then I want to kind of dig in a little bit with the kind of two big areas that this really tells us about related to what we see happening. The first is that, as I alluded, the IRS officially ended direct file by confirming to the states it would not be available next tax season. Second, a Brookings expert, Vanessa Williamson, published her book, The Price of Democracy, which makes the case that paying taxes isn't just a financial transaction. It's one of the few universal acts of democratic participation. So that is that paying taxes is part of our direct payment into the government and gives us a view into what we see our government roles as. So let's take a minute to dig in and start by saying, taxes aren't just about taking your money. They're a signifier of the right to representation. And now I might have started this segment off with talking about things like a reference to the Boston Tea Party or the DC license plate, which is taxation without representation. But I think Lauren wants to go back even further because she is super cool. So let's start with the Magna Carta. Lauren, tell us about the history of taxes.
Okay, so so many caveats here of one, you should definitely, Vanessa Williamson's books came out just today. It is now Tuesday. And I met her earlier this year and just have been obsessed with this topic ever since she just persuaded me of like, this is so important. But I am not a historian nor a tax expert. So huge apologies to what I mess up here. But I think the narrative of this is amazing. All right, so Magna Carta. You all will surely remember that back in the early 1200s, our English barons got really, really mad at King John because
you might remember that from the best Disney cartoon of all time, Robin Hood.
Robin Hood?
He was just Prince John at the time, but he becomes King John. And part of the reasons the barons are mad is they have to keep paying to get King Richard out of Hawk and his crusades. Anyway, please carry on.
Anyway, that box Robin Hood.
God, it was such a lovely love story too. They were really mad about taxes because, as you said, like King Richard, while he was off with Robin Hood, I guess, fighting wars, they had imposed a lot of really inconsistent, arbitrary taxes, obviously without consent. So the barons raised armies and seized London and threatened the king with a headless future unless he met with them and agreed to what became the Magna Carta, which was kind of disavowed shortly thereafter, but we'll set that aside. The king, what it said is that the king can't impose or collect new taxes without common council of the realm, which sounds super important. And that all that meant at the time was the subjects who were basically just like barons and clergy and not most people. But that was a big deal to say that you had to have consent to taxation. This gave birth to the view that taxation and representation are, if not totally inseparable, they're super interlinked. You can't take people's money without giving them a say in some form and how it's used. Now, do you feel that way today? Probably not. But there is a correlation between your tax based by entities that you voted into office. So this may sound familiar to those who have a DC license plate. That taxes are a way to define who belongs and also who contributes to the realm or to our state, and what the collective ambitions that we share of what we should actually be doing with any of this money. Is it an investment? And Vanessa and others who study this, like, make this point of like, taxes are a mirror of our democratic expectation. What we choose to fund really, really reflects what our collective priorities are. And those change a lot over time because you have security or welfare, infrastructure, or climate. And we've really used taxes in different ways across American history, depending on how we defined who counted and also how we let them represent themselves in terms of the use of any of that revenue. So there are, for example, you can look at our current, I came up with this phrase, loopalicious outsourced system, and how it reflects probably a declining trust in government competence or in fairness. The fact that like there's so many loopholes, and the way you file your taxes is to contract with a private sector company.
I think one thing we noted earlier that I just will point out here, and it's both consistent with the Magna Carta history, which has a whole political economy. Jan Elster, it's like the core insight of kind of Anglo-American institutions is this respect for private property, and that goes back to Magna Carta. But it's also that's why Article 1 invests taxes and spending with the legislative branch.
Yes.
It is the branch of the people.
Direct
it is the
representation
representative
of the people.
Yes. Right.
I agree.
So it all comes together.
And I think maybe like tying an even tighter, maybe pulling that bow a little tighter.
Yeah.
It's right. In America in particular, it strikes me that so much of our governance reform and so much of how we think about the role of government relates to how the government should or should not spend taxpayer dollars. You hear people even now saying, I don't want my taxpayer dollars spent on these wars. I don't want them spent on illegal immigrants. I don't want them spent on certain kinds of women's reproductive health care, et cetera, et cetera. That core notion that your taxpayer dollars tie you to the priorities of the government. So let's take a moment before we dig in on the specific on direct filing. Mm-hmm. In the American context, I think a core point here is that nearly every major American governance reform has had a sort of mirror of tax reform or tax policy, I'll call it, to try to drive that state objective and reach. And maybe taking in parts, Lauren, starting with you, both what did that look like in the past and what can we learn from that as we look forward?
Okay, so I'll start with Reconstruction, then Progressive Era, and if others want to jump in. So, like, this is deeply oversimplifying a whole lot of things that were going on, but it's really interesting to think about it in this context. Reconstruction, a whole lot of policy and other shifts going on at that point in time, but one of the things worth looking at in terms of taxes is around property taxes, the introduction of that, and particularly the abuse of that when it came to former slaves, and also poll taxes, which also became an abused system in order to limit access of people who are sensibly were citizens to the polls. And so those were both meant to define who counts while counting out by both taking advantage of those who they said they didn't count, while also raising revenue in order to develop universal services, quote unquote, that weren't actually universal in truth, whether it be education or other things like that. So this is it's a really interesting way to look at taxation's role in citizenship and who the state serves. Then you get to, and again, this is a whole lot of stuff in a tiny little analogy here, the Progressive Era and the New Deal, where income taxes and corporate taxes start becoming a tool for building the administrative state, building all of the apparatus that was used to take power away from corporate interests and build a state that did a whole lot of stuff. So you have the 16th Amendment that established income tax. You have FDR later on, dramatically expanded these taxes in order to fund services. And it's an interesting story of how you can take collective resources and translate them into all kinds of ways that were meant to be beneficial for the entire country. Then you move on post-war into Great Society, with taxation as the foundation for, like, now slightly broadening out our universal services and helping invest in a middle-class identity. And what's interesting, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm an expert, but like the high marginal rates on the wealthy at that point in time, like people didn't love them, but it was also kind of seen as a point of investment. This is part of our national investment in our infrastructure. And taxes also, maybe less popularly at the time, underwrote a lot of the civil rights enforcement that went on in Medicare, Medicaid, and some of the anti-poverty programs. And then we get to Reagan. So Aaron, do you want to jump in on like how we kind of made a big
Why
abrupt
do I
shift
have
there?
to do Reagan? Yeah, I
Right?
mean, like,
Come
at some
on.
point, basically, people were like, "The state is too big,
Yep.
and the state is supported by these taxes, and so we have 2 things. One, there's a wing of the party, the Republican Party in particular, that would like to shrink the state, that is sometimes called starve the beast. That was very dramatically shown by Sam Brown back in Kansas for 8 years, for example. And there's also then like a Laffer Carver, the whole like set of economic arguments that like cutting taxes actually spurs growth and you'll actually get the same,
Don't start.
revenues. That has never actually been the case, but it remains sort of foundational. And there's a little bit part of what's going on here is like a period of stagflation and high inflation. And so cutting government spending is sort of one way to get some of that out of under control. But it really shifts that orthodoxy, as you say, Lauren, to being around lower tax. All taxes are bad. You can't, you're going to have George Bush run on no new taxes, George Bush, the father. And then you have Clinton era, there's a Clinton tax hike that then leads to kind of bloodbath in 1994. So there's a lot of, learned lessons about the politics of taxation and how we do that. And I think we're pretty much still living in that same narrative today.
Yeah, and I will say, the Clinton era, what's interesting is a lot of it was driven by the notion of incentives, which we have never come back to. So both the government payments and the taxes were all centered around this concept of incentives and incentivizing the right people for the right thing and making sure people were for responding it. But the downside was it pushed a lot more onus out and intuitively out of the federal government and onto people and onto solutions, and also created lots of caveats and contingencies into the tax code that created, I think, what did you call it? Loopholicious?
Delicious. Yeah.
Loopholicious.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a uh, like Black Eyed Peas era song that could be
Totally.
adapted to that. But I think today, you have a tax code that has lots of loopholes and carve outs that are extremely complicated and that, many people have to pay someone a service or an online platform to help them file taxes correctly. And that really was the driving motivation behind this direct file approach, a free government service that actually worked and let taxpayers pay it and file their simple federal returns with a clean design with some accessibility features built in, including bilingual access and customer support. And it was not, from my perspective, not just the tax piece, which is great, but also the digital service piece, in which the federal government was meeting the modern age with not a growth in workforce or cost, but really a growth in a solution space that it was needed. So how did it go so wrong, Lauren?
Oh God. Okay. So to me, just to build on your point around like why direct file was amazing, is it showed that government could actually do this, build something in-house that worked and it was free. And shifted the narrative or tried to shift the narrative back from like taxes is the thing that the government runs and like let's both make it easier, but also maybe we can start dipping the toe in this being something that we talk more about. And here's why we pay taxes. Like that's not what direct file is meant it to do. But the fact that it was designed in-house by the federal government, taking some of this power away from corporations, was an interesting first step into that conversation. And that people saw direct file as proof that you could actually have a competent federal government that designed good stuff and builds good trust, builds trust through design. Whereas opponents were like, oh, no, 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 no. Government overreach, unfair. This is very bad. Competition with private firms, everything's fine. And the Trump administration was pretty, actually, they initially said that they would keep it and then have taken a series of steps over the course of the last several months to say they're ending it, to be ending it, and to be like really clear, like, oh, no, no, this is not going to be accessible to the states, which is where it's really important to be able to have the relationship with states as they're collecting this. And like to me, I think it's an interesting juxtaposition of like, do we actually trust the state to provide this kind of service and digital infrastructure? Or have we ceded this entire interface of democracy of like you are investing in your country to private intermediaries. And if IRS cannot be the one that owns that interface, then who does? Apparently, it's a whole bunch of places that we remember exist.
TurboTax.
TurboTax, yeah. Remember they exist like in March every year. Like, oh, that's right. If I pay $30 or actually increasingly more, whatever it is, they'll do my taxes for me. And like there's just a ton of lobbying and opposition to direct file overall, but like it really, really sold people like this is what it's possible to work. And I think that like to me, like I hate to make like everything fall on like direct file. It's just like the impetus for like are things going to work in government or not? But it was such a great example of like this is possible, and it's such a great example of we can actually design and do good things. And then it was taken away despite it being enormously popular.
In that context, maybe, and pulling back a little bit, it seems like connecting the reality of direct files experience to a combination of lobbying and pushback from industry to a kind of rollback of a government offered feature. What does this tell us, or what do we think this tells us about what we want from government? Or maybe put more bluntly, pulling the through line from that discussion on Reagan's government is a problem to today's kind of decline in state capacity, is what does direct fire tell us about the theory of government and what we should, or what the American people want from their government?
That's a really great question. That is like 7 more episodes. I mean, to me, this is it's like the Trump administration is not at all internally consistent in terms of like how they think about government run stuff versus non-government run stuff, and like where we invest in the private sector and the kind of crony capitalism that goes on. But I think they didn't want something to have been a success for the Biden administration, one. And two, there was so much pushback in having this be a positive thing that government did that people really, really liked. Like that starts changing the narrative around like, what is it possible for us to expect of government? Like, can we expect good things of government as opposed to consistent frustration when it comes of like filing for Medicare or Social Security and things like that? They're most well-run government services. There's some good research on this. People don't actually know that they're government. They just assume if it's working well, then it can't possibly be government. An opportunity to shift that narrative shifts what is possible in terms of like what government actually delivers for people. So not just like the traditional services we think of today, but what could that look like if we had proactive services and benefits where you just received it as opposed to having to file for it? Or what if you had much more transparency in terms of how your dollars were spent? And I think there's lots of interesting ideas on like where we're going to go in the future on like how tax innovation and government innovation could work based on this experience. And I'm just really sad that like we had that moment in time kind of cut off from us at this point.
Okay, well, maybe then just closing us out, sort of what should we be looking for? What do we think this means for the future of tax innovation specifically, and more broadly, the democracy that lets large parts of tax compliance be handled by for-profit companies? What does the future of tax look like here?
So like there are so many more experts on this topic that are doing great work, but a few things that stood out to me is like it's interesting to see what Doge and the Trump administration is doing with data. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity for automation and data sharing in government that we don't do right now, both because of actual real laws and the laws that are sort of made up in people's heads. And so a lot of those have good reasons in order to keep our data secure and safe and out of the hands of entities that would abuse it. But I think that there's a lot of also some opportunity around how could we make a whole lot of things easier if we were able to better access and manage some of the data that the federal government collects and we have to provide to them on an ongoing basis. There's also, I mean, Direct File showed that when you have inclusive and people-focused design on revenue collection, maybe you can start moving toward a world where you're talking about participatory budgeting or tax dashboards, or there's some experience that we see in Seoul and some US cities in Brazil, where they're testing whether or not the transparency that technology offers can actually help rebuild trust. There's also like COP is going on this week? It's going on recently. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of interesting discussion around like using taxes to as we have for a while, to further environmental goals. A recent one came up around like taxing private planes. I thought that was interesting. Some of these work, some of these don't. We're all still learning from this. But like taxes is a tool for industrial policy, as a tool for getting people to care about their government and care about their country. Like that is a long history, and it will be interesting to see how we continue to make it more loophole-licious in the future.
Well, if there was anything that could cheer you up more than the future of tax innovation, it is the potential for restarting nuclear weapons testing.
This week for warning signs, we are dealing less with a quiet issue that has bubbled up and more with like a very big, very loud, important issue that has again bubbled up to maybe some more importance than we all might have expected at this time in our fall. For our guests, we are welcoming Heather Williams, who is the director on the Project on Nuclear Issues at CSIS. No surprise, since given her title and given my hinting, we're going to talk nuclear weapons this week. To set the stage, this is not a topic I necessarily wanted to become prominent, but here we are. A few weeks ago, President Trump announced that he wanted to restart nuclear weapons testing, which, to be fair, surprised a lot of people. Pretty bold. We haven't tested nuclear weapons since 1992, and we'll get into a little bit about why. But then almost immediately, kind of embarrassingly, the Secretary of Energy basically said, oh, no, not actually happening. He said, actually, we're not doing that right now, which is interesting because usually when an administration makes a major policy announcement, particularly the president, the cabinet doesn't say like, oh, wait, never mind, particularly on social media. So this is the world we're in right now. Augmenting that, we've had a lot of nuclear thoughts in the background because of a recent movie that came out, House of Dynamite. This all kind of adds up to none of us quite wanted this to be a topic that we are having to focus on too much. Fortunately, Heather does that for us professionally, but wanted to bring to light some of the issues this raises in terms of nuclear governance and accountability, how modern nuclear competition works out, and also clearly how we feel about the movie. So we first wanted to start with the most literal question. What actually happened here? Was Trump just like floating an idea and got shut down? Is this something that seems to be an actual real plan behind the scenes? Does the moment actually call for nuclear weapons testing the way we haven't done before? And is this administration trying to signal like what's up with how it thinks about deterrence?
So what does this moment mean and what's actually going on? What was it meant to signal? I'm going to be honest, I don't know because the president hasn't clarified. Yeah, I want to be totally transparent. I can't read the president's mind, and particularly on this post that he put out on his social media platform. So not always the best way to clarify a nuanced nuclear policy issue, but we are where we are. The Russians have also made a point. They've made this point a few times in the past week that they have been asking Trump for clarification or asking the administration for clarification on what he meant. They also are not getting answers. So it's still pretty murky what exactly the president meant by this announcement. But I can try to break it down like this. I think the president could have meant one of four things. I'm not sure that the president knows about the nuance across these four things, but here are the implications. It could be one of four things. The first would be a return to explosive weapons testing. So either underground tests, I don't think above ground tests are on the cards. We're not going to see any mushroom clouds going off, but it could be a return to explosive testing. North Korea is the only country that has been doing that in recent years, but that is one option. The second option would be what's called supercritical testing, where it is a nuclear experiment that produces a self-sustaining chain reaction, which means that it has a yield. It's not going to show up on seismic monitors. We might never know that it happened, but you can do this to test the plutonium, test weapons designs, things like that. Option number 3 would be subcritical testing, which is nuclear experiments that don't produce a yield. And the last thing is he might not have been talking about nuclear warheads at all. He might have just been talking about delivery vehicles because he recently announced that they had tested an underwater drone. They had tested the Burevestnik. And so it could have just been, a semantics issue that has led to all of this kerfluffle and excitement about what exactly the president meant. But I think we can rule out explosives testing. Folks from the administration have come out and said he didn't mean delivery vehicles. So that leaves us with buckets 2 or 3. I wouldn't rule anything out because, again, he hasn't clarified. But just something, one point I really want to stress on the supercritical testing side is that State Department compliance reports for the past few years across administrations have suggested that Russia and China might be conducting this type of supercritical testing, which is nuclear experiments that produce a self-sustaining chain reaction. And based on our interpretation of the nuclear test ban treaty, that means that they would be cheating, which is why it's come up in these compliance reports. And so because of the way that Trump's post framed the issue, it made it sound like, well, Russia and China are doing this thing. We have to do this thing too. And that's why that's kind of where my money is on what he might have meant. He might have gotten some briefing saying, we think Russia and China might be in violation of some of these agreements. And that could be what prompted his post. But again, I'm not going to try to read the man's mind on this one.
I have so many questions. I will try to combine 2 into 1, and then we'll drill down of like wherever excites us the most. So the first is the kind of like the why should our listeners care? Because like unlike people on the screen right now, probably not a lot of people who are listening spend a lot of their time thinking about nuclear weapons policy and are not necessarily immediately grappling with why was it a big deal for the president to say he was going to do this and to have it walked back. But then as it relates to that, I'd love to offer just a little bit of context in the background of like, why did we stop testing, at least in some of the contexts you're talking about, why did we stop testing in the first place? So let's start there. And there's lots of deep holes that we can get after that.
Yeah, so in terms of why we stopped testing, so as you said, we stopped testing in 92. There were a host of reasons. The first one being we had conducted over 1,000 explosive nuclear tests by that point, and we'd gotten a lot of data. We had gotten a lot of all the data that we thought was necessary to assure that our nuclear arsenal was credible. And so that's the primary reason. If we ever do return to testing, it would probably be for technical reasons. Things like, plutonium ages. We don't totally understand how plutonium will age. And so conducting tests might help us understand that better in the future. But in 92, it was decided, do you know what? We have enough test data. The other reason is just to really stress, nuclear testing caused some pretty horrific environmental and humanitarian consequences. The downwinders in Nevada, Utah, Colorado, who live downwind, as the name suggests, from the nuclear test sites, were really active in pushing for a testing moratorium. But then also, this was like the end of the Cold War, this like flurry of arms control activity and disarmament efforts that were going on. And so the political context in which we stopped also really matters. It's worth noting Russia and China also stopped explosive testing around the same time, but they had both done a lot fewer tests than we had. Russia had done a couple hundred fewer. China had done less than 100 tests, explosive tests. So if we did return, and this gets to your first question, why would this be a big deal? The number one reason I think this would be a big deal is because if the U.S. returns to explosive testing, other countries will follow. It won't be like, oh, we're just going to do one. No, it would be this cascade of other countries that start testing. And the country that will benefit the most from a return to nuclear testing is China. They don't have as much test data by orders of magnitude. If they want to try out new weapons designs, they stopped producing fissile material a while ago. If they want to test out how their plutonium is behaving, there's a host of reasons why China would probably love to return to nuclear testing to get that data. So that's the reason I think we should care about nuclear testing. In terms of why to care about nuclear weapons, I think that people this is where I always say, like, those of us who work on nuclear weapons, we literally live in a nuclear silo. And it's so obvious to us. Of course, these things are really important. Of course, everybody. Yes, they are a big deal. That's what we all try to tell ourselves sometimes. But for the rest of the world, they kind of left the public consciousness. You don't see them on the news every day. You don't see them being used in war, thank goodness. But we do still live with tens of thousands of these weapons that have just unprecedented destructive power, and they're still in the hands of 9 countries. The final reason I would say why people should care is that there has been a very carefully crafted system trying to manage all of those thousands and thousands of weapons to prevent them from proliferating, to prevent them from being used. And that system is crumbling.
Mm-hmm.
The guardrails are falling off. And so nuclear weapons might not have been part of the public consciousness for quite a while. They are becoming part of the public consciousness again for the wrong reasons.
Or maybe, so maybe I'll ask this in a slightly controversial way, sort of in 2 parts, but maybe then it's valuable to have this notion of nuclear risk, this concept of nuclear weapons and what they are returned to the public side, to public consciousness. But the flip side is, that is obviously much less controlled in what the public thinks about. So how do we think about, and maybe for our listeners to better understand, what are the less explosive institutional mechanisms that allow verification and validation of our stockpile, and what are the trade-offs there in terms of effectiveness and understanding, our stockpile quality and our weapons quality, but also in the public consciousness side.
Also, is it just so tempting for people who work on nuclear weapons issues every day to just use all kinds of puns and analogies all the time? Because I would not be able to stop myself.
Me too. It'd be hard to be taken seriously. Yeah.
I am not good at puns, but I appreciate a good pun. And so I saw what you did there, Rada, and I greatly enjoyed it. But yeah, I worked in a silo pun, and we're just over 10 minutes into the conversation. So I'll take that as a win. But in terms of, Rada, to your first point, I actually think it's a really good thing that nuclear weapons are coming back into the public discussion, because they are still all out there. I think it's hard to have a public discussion about them with the necessary nuance, though, because it really quickly turns into, oh, these things are really, really bad and we have to get rid of them, or we should be using them for nuclear war fighting. And, those are 2 very extreme positions. And there's a lot of space and a lot of challenging policy questions in between there. Should you elevate nuclear risk if it means preventing the likelihood of nuclear use? That's the eternal kind of moral paradox and security paradox around nuclear weapons. But I'm sure we'll talk about the movie in a little bit, but that's perhaps my biggest plus from House of Dynamite, is it has people thinking about nuclear issues again. But to the question about why about testing and how are we confirming, the credibility of the arsenal? So we do these nuclear experiments, the subcritical testing that has allowed the national labs to validate every year that the nuclear arsenal is safe, secure, and reliable without a return to explosive testing. And the lab directors have done that every single year. They have done it under Republican and Democrat administrations. Political leaders, such as the administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration, have consistently said we don't need to return to nuclear testing. And so you have the political and scientific leadership coming out and saying we don't need to return to explosive weapons testing. With that said, I've written a lot over the past few weeks about Trump's comments, and a few folks from the technical community have reached out to me and said, well, actually, it might be nice to get more test data, particularly about how things age. Do the parts still work the way that they're meant to? Some of them will even admit, I'm a scientist. I want to actually test my theory. But it's like nobody that I have talked to is desperate to see a return to explosive weapons testing or any sort of underground testing like that. We aren't in that space. And so that's why I'm leaning towards thinking that the president meant supercritical testing. But again, it's really hard to know.
Okay, so we weren't going to do this topic this week, but then while debating it, we got so excited, realized we had to. And that topic is how early, in our Gong Show conversation, how early is too early to decorate for Christmas? And we all violent views here. I'll start with Erin.
So my views are very much informed by growing up in Kansas City, which is dominated in the holiday season by the so-called Plaza Lights, which is like this shopping district that does all these lights, and they turn the lights on with a big switch and a big ceremony on Thanksgiving night. And that means nowhere in town does anybody else turn on Christmas lights before the Plaza Lights come on. It's probably, I mean, I'm sure if you go to Costco, there's like, lots of Christmas stuff out, but like there's no decorations really public until the Plaza Lights go on. So I'm a pretty strict not before Thanksgiving situation. But I also have never been in my own home for Christmas except for the pandemic. So like decorate when you want and they stay up as long as you want and you're not here for actual Christmas. So roll them if you got them. Smoke them if you got them. All of the above.
My view on this is so it's both related to the timing of putting up decorations, but also the timing of two other very important milestones. One, when you can start adding eggnog to coffee. And to me, that is probably post Thanksgiving, because otherwise I'm going to gain 10 pounds. It's good. It's so bad. So good. It's so bad. And the other is when you can start validly watching Netflix Christmas movies. And to me, that is probably the day after Thanksgiving, unless you can find a couple of Thanksgiving themed ones. And there are a few. The decoration, to me, it takes place definitely the day after Thanksgiving when you're like, fat and full of cheese and you don't really know what else to do. It's actually really convenient to be able to think about it that way. Rada?
So I have my nerdy version of this take, which is Thanksgiving can occur at different times in November. First of all, I should note that I love Christmas and I love Christmas decorations and I love Christmas songs and just everything about it. So I think if Thanksgiving is on the early side, so in the low 20s. I think the earliest Thanksgiving, which as folks know is the fourth Thursday of November. So there's like a range that can occur in. So the low 20s, then you wait for Thanksgiving. But if it's like late 20s, like 27, 28, like this year, then that feels a little bit too late. At which point I think you can revert to the week that would have been the early week of Thanksgiving and decorate sort of on that first weekend before. You can't have a
Christmas tree up at Thanksgiving, right?
Yes,
that's not allowed. No.
Yes, you can. And also, I'll note that I believe in the emotional necessity exemption to all holiday decoration, which is if you're feeling sad and you need to listen to Christmas music or put up Christmas decorations, you can do it whenever your heart pleases you. So that could be early November, but it could also be July. And if eggnog were available sometimes in July, I'd probably put it in my coffee. So there you have it.
And with that, it has been another delightful episode. If you are still listening, if you could please, pretty please, with sugar or eggnog on top, do the loveliest favor and leave us a rating or review in Apple or Spotify or wherever your heart gets its podcast. If process is truly your Valentine, please share this episode with a friend or an enemy, whatever makes your heart happy. And we'll see you next time.